Hope everyone is keeping well in these very strange times. Also a very warm welcome to our presenters today, Deasún and Zorana, and our South Region's Mary Doyle Kent. My name is Calorie, I chair the South East Treaty. On behalf of the South East Region, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. So it's practical tips for launching your B2B projects quickly. So before often I hand to Mary, who's chaired today's a little background. We as a committee had a request by our incoming President Maurice Buckley earlier this summer for projects in support of national recovery. So our South East Region's response to this is our webinar series, which will run every 3 weeks up until April-May 2021. So our webinar series is a free CPD series aimed to promote the positive impact engineers in our region have on our everyday lives across a range of engineering disciplines and areas of expertise. So from project management, key infrastructure developments, innovation, online working, STEM, medical devices, carbon reduction, sustainable and active transport. This series will present high quality content CPD of guaranteed interest to all engineers. So today's webinar is the second in the series, following an excellent presentation we had on the Waterford North Quays project a few weeks ago. So again, on behalf of the South East Region members, very warm welcome to Deasún and Zorana, and I would like to give our sincere thanks to you both for presenting to us today and being so generous with your time. I suppose it's one of the positives of COVID that it gives us the opportunity to have speakers of the caliber of Deasún and Zorana, so even if it is just virtually. So maybe someday we might get you across in the flesh. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to my colleague on committee and last year's chair of the South East Region, the very wonderful Mary Doyle Kent, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. Thanks again for the introduction, and we're delighted to have these wonderful speakers with us this evening. My name is Mary Doyle Kent, and first of all, I have the honour of introducing Dr. Deasún Conchúir. Dr. Deasún is the principal of Scatterworks.com, which is a Swiss-based project consultancy, but he is of Irish origin, I'm delighted to say. He's a chartered engineer and a fellow of Engineers Ireland and IET, and he has over 4 decades of project consulting, okay, in over 40 countries. So a very distinguished guest we have this evening. He has academic leadership experience, including the first head of the School of Engineering of Waterford RTC, or WIT as we call it now, and soon to be in the next 12 months or so, the University of the Southeast. He's held a number of global roles for Project Management Institute, and he is multilingual. And Dr. Deasún has with him his colleague, Dr. Zorana Boltic, who is currently president of Project Management Institute Serbia chapter. So she comes all the way to us from Serbia this evening. Dr. Zorana has more than 20 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, which is very good for Ireland as well, because we do have a lot of pharmaceutical industries in the Southeast region. So your experience will be very relevant, I think, to the people who are on this webinar this evening. She's a certified Six Sigma Black Belt and a principal of AIM Professional. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over this webinar today to Dr. Deasún and Dr. Zorana. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that introduction. And just to say that my colleague Zorana is also an engineer, so we all have different flavors of engineering backgrounds, so very suitable for this afternoon. So we've been working away for quite some years. And if you look at the map there, the furthest in the bottom right is New Zealand and the top left is Canada. So we've been in lots of different places. For example, even today, I got a call from a participant we had in India a few years ago. And we've worked with lots and lots of companies across sector. And I thought I'd just show you just 1 or 2 of the projects that we've worked on to give you a flavor. This particular one was interesting because we had a client who had troubles delivering their material. And then their product was then going to another client further in the chain. And so they had shortage of materials. So they were annoying their client, and they said, I will tell you what we'll do. We'll be really good for 20 weeks. And then we'll jump up and say, hello, we were really good now. Are we good boys now? And can you deal with this again? And at the same time, they were going to go to the client of the client, in other words, 2 steps down the chain, and they were going to say to them, can you tell them how good we are? So that was part of the strategy. And what actually came out was very interesting, because the second level people were actually not annoyed. So there was no reason to wait 20 weeks. So they were able to move that entire phase 20 weeks forward. So anyone who works on projects will know saving 20 weeks is worth having, because the alternative is working all the weekends you ever had. So that was one. So that was an insight type thing. And then we had another one where there was a company selling a food ingredients product to China, and they had to get every product registered, and they found it very difficult. The guy doing it was German, and he wasn't, you know, not Chinese, so he didn't have the cultural match, as it were, for that. It was far away and it was costing a lot. And what came out of our work with him was that he decided to come up with a standard process and document it. And then when he had clients who came to him after that, they'd say, well, how do you do it? And he'd say, well, normally we do it this way. And they would say, well, that looks good. And then he would say, well, and I think it would be fair if you paid for half of it. And they said, yes. So what he got is he got far better implementation of his products, because he had people on the receiving side who were taking their role as stakeholders. And he also halved his cost. So those are just a couple of things that we've been involved in. Today, I'm not quite sure how many people are online, but we're intending that you would interact with us as we go. So don't wait till the end to pose questions. And there are 2 ways of doing it. And one of them is to type into the chat, and Mary is looking at that and will read them out. And the other way of doing it is to turn on your microphone and speak. But if you're not speaking, please leave the microphone off, just in case there's a dog in the background or something like that. If there's a lot of people online, it makes a noise. But we do intend this to be interactive, and take your questions and comments as we go. So just the agenda, the first thing that we have is what drives business to business projects. And then we're going to focus on the quick start of all the things you can do in projects. We've picked out a few things that make things go faster, because that's what matters. A lot of things in projects are getting agreement and the person isn't there and you lose time and so on. So we're focusing on that. And then, as I say, we move on to questions and answers, but that will be intermixed as we go. And if there's time left, we'll do that, and then we'll close and hand back. So just to check that we're all online there, maybe you could just put a quick message in to Mary, or open your microphone and say hello, or if you have a question or a comment, make it now. So Mary, are there any comments coming up there? Maybe people will just tell you where they are. That would be a nice thing, just so that we know that they're listening.
Nothing so far, Deasún.
Okay. Well, we'll move ahead anyway. So what I'd like to do now is to go into the typical project drivers.
Yeah, well, before we go into specifics of B2B projects, it's a good idea to look at the typical project drivers in general. So these might include, but are not limited to, for example, business development, regulations, emergency, etc. Important thing is that whatever they are, these are the crucial forces behind the successful development of a project. And they usually represent a starting point to identify the problems to be solved and analyze the needs to be satisfied, and of course to determine the possible solutions that should be implemented by your project. So by definition, business development, so Deasún, if you could just move to the next slide. The business development entails tasks and processes to develop and implement growth opportunities within and between organizations, such as usually increased earnings, profitability, market positioning, etc. Usually the projects in this area of business development start when the contract is already signed, and therefore not a huge effort is needed to convince the stakeholders. This means that all the different departments and activities are driven by and aligned with the business development goals, such as market positioning, new product launch, or expanding the business to new geographies, for example. But on the other hand, when it comes to regulations, though, Deasún, could you, when it comes to the regulations, these projects are often done more reluctantly or with lower priority and usually require more convincing of the stakeholders. These are, for example, projects initiated to comply with certain legal requirements, environmental regulations, or some other legal legally imposed things that we need to comply with. And what happens in projects that are done as a response to an emergency situation, especially if the organization doesn't have a standard procedure to be followed in order to recover from the events such as factory damage due to a fire or product recall, for example. And especially when we are talking about this crisis, in particular in COVID-19 recovery projects, for example, where the company needs to renew its offer to match new user patterns or diversify its activities to generate new income streams, for example. It is quite a challenge to establish the required project management structure really quickly in order to enable fast decision making and act promptly to overcome the existing crisis. Then, if we compare the different project types, it seems that commercial projects delivering a product or service are in general easier to start because they bring really tangible benefits to the organizations, while the non-routine projects not driven directly by revenue, the companies are more often facing the challenges when it comes to the agreement of specific roles and responsibilities on the project. Now, when it comes to B2B projects specifically, such as, for example, e-commerce, digital marketing, or other exchange of service, for example, the challenges can be quite specific and unique to this particular arena. The problems in B2B projects are often related to particular solutions that should contribute to increasing revenue performance or, for example, reducing operating costs. And they are also very technical or technology oriented as well. Therefore, it takes time and really clear process to lay out how the solution meets the buyer's need. And depending on the complexity of this solution, more and more decision makers are involved in the process because the focus is on the critical business issues they must resolve. And the quick start strategy is really needed in order to significantly increase the chances for success. So, Deasún, would you continue with
yeah,
the
I would.
strategies?
Just before I go forward, let me just ask you again, it would be interesting to get some examples from people online of B2B projects, some of the things that you've been involved in, because B2B, if you're inside a company and you have to do something for the boss and you can't do it, you tell them, I'm sorry, I'll do it next week and so on. But when you're dealing with outside things like the data road is going to open, or, you know, the bridge recently, for example, things like that, then you've got a big handover between different organizations. So I'd be interested from people who are online for maybe the title of a couple of examples. Maybe, as I say, you can say them, that would be great, or type them in and Mary will read them out for us. Mary, do you have any yourself?
I can't think of any at the moment, and I think our audience is quite shy as well. So if we come across any, I'll certainly bring them to your attention.
I mean, one that occurs to me is that bridge that was opened recently, that coming from Wexford to Waterford, you know, that was being built for a long, long time and so on. But at the end of the project, the engineer people hand over, and then the county councillor, whoever it is, takes over the bridge. And that's a really, really big changeover. And because it's between businesses, everyone works flat out to make sure that it works. But sometimes those things don't work as smoothly as that one did.
I'm just wondering, is Christy on the line? Christy is our vice chair, and he was one of the project engineers on that, or one of the managers of the groundworks around that. Christy, are you there?
I know Christy's on, but Tim McDermott, who was on the project, Tim is here with us as well. So Tim might give us some insight into that. I hate to put him on the spot.
Tim, if you turn on your microphone there, I mean, who were the organizations? You know, was it? I'm not as close to it as you are, but was it, you know, county council or who was it took over the project? No comment. Okay, but you get the basic idea. The basic idea is it changes hands somewhere along the way. And sometimes it's between divisions of a company, and sometimes it's between different organizations. And in fact, because they're different organizations, they have different rules. And I ran into one project, in fact, where there was a company in Canada delivering to France, and they had problems. And to cut a long story short, the French people had to write down on a bit of paper, yeah, this stuff is okay. And on the same bit of paper, there were other things they didn't want to share. So because of that, although they noted that the product coming in met the spec, they wouldn't share the bit of paper proving it because they didn't want to share the other information on the page. So you get different practices. And another thing that I've often heard is when you get takeovers between two companies in the same area, that they have what appear to be the same processes and the same titles and all that. And then when they get down to the details, the actual details are very different. So an example there was Nokia and Siemens. Nokia making networks for mobile phones.
Just before you move on, we have three people that are giving their experiences to us. The first is from Andrew Lennon. Andrew has written, I do analysis of subsea cables for offshore wind farms, and most of my projects have a tight deadline and have both routine and complex aspects. So that's one example. The second is...
Could I maybe read them all out, and then I'll come back to that because I have a query on that one.
The second is from Michael Sweetman, who is also on our committee. Michael works in a pharmaceutical company, and he has written down new product launch for customer with a question mark. And then the third one is from Tim McDermott, and he's saying that there was a handover between the contractor and the O&M county for the operation of the road. So I think that's referring back to your bridge.
Oh, that was nice. So let me just pick up there that on the product launch for pharmaceuticals is interesting because it depends on the industry that you're in. If you're launching pharmaceutical, like we've seen, you have to test it. When it's tested, you release it. And if it's not tested, you don't release it. All that sort of stuff. And then when you do day X, it's suddenly there. But there are other industries where it's not as cut and dried. And an obvious example is IT. So for example, you get Windows 99 or whatever, Windows 10, Windows 11, and so on. And then they announce Windows 12 will come on this day. And on that day, lo and behold, you get something and it says Windows 12. But then you get an update the week after. So they're very lucky in that industry that they don't, you can have a sort of a market launch, but you don't have to have absolutely everything. But if you're doing something like take the bridge again, you can't say, oh, we've done everything except the safety barriers or something like that. You have to do the whole thing. And I think from my experience of working with pharma industry, if you're launching a product, it really is watertight, much more so than, for example, software. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I have to jump in there because I think that having the fact that the pharmaceutical industry is like after aircraft, like the most regulated industry in the world, I think launching a new product for, especially for a customer, is quite a complex endeavor because it encompasses a lot of regulatory requirements and various different steps that need to be followed in order to actually come to the situation where you can test the product and start the sales. So a lot of things, and it's usually years, because of all the documentation requirements, the regulatory, the trials, the contracts, the validations and so on. So it's quite a complex endeavor, I'd say.
And often it can't be done in one country. For example, I'm in Switzerland and the population is too small to test drugs. So if you want to test something when you want to test it in 50 million people, you can't give 5
Oh,
times the
you are
dose.
talking about the innovation drugs, but even
Well,
with
any drug.
generics, I mean, even with the generics,
Yeah.
it's quite a huge, because especially if you are aiming at different
Yeah.
markets, then the regulations are different everywhere. So
Absolutely. And the other one that I wanted to come back on was on this one about the undersea cables. I can understand that that's a very demanding, and it's a very clear business to business. But the comment was made that it's that the timeline is tight. And I'd be interested to know why it was tight. Is it because a lot of time was lost and the timeline couldn't be moved, or the people who had the money just sort of said it has to happen, or anything? Mary, can we hear back on that?
Andrew, have you anything to add to that, please? Andrew Lennon, maybe you'd like to unmute your mic. So we've nothing at the moment anyway.
Okay, well, he might come back later. But
Yeah.
what I find is that there's two categories.
Hello there.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Hello there. Yeah, this is Andrew. Yeah, it's often tight because the developer leaves the cables until quite late on.
Okay.
And they order the cables before they do all the analysis. And occasionally on one very, very large wind farm off the UK, the developer had a last minute change in a protection system. They resized it. They were worried about it not fitting through. And I had to redo a whole analysis in 2 weeks.
Oh, well, okay. Okay, that's interesting, yeah. So, I mean, again, that can do it, because I was working one time with people making railway trains. And what they do is they'd say, well, there are 10 coaches on the train, and each coach has 2 bogies, so it has 8 wheels. So that's, so many wheels. And they used to order the wheels right at the beginning before they had done any design. So it depends on where you are. Okay, let's move forward. So thanks for those examples there. So what we're looking at here is quick start, and what we have here is just a mix of all sorts of techniques that we hear of in the line of project management. Assumptions. We have assumptions in projects, particularly when we don't know. And if somebody says, I can't start until I have all the answers, the problem is you never get them. You never get stuff in the right order. So one of the tricks of the trade is to make an assumption and then validate it later, but it allows you to move. I could pick up other ones here. Expert judgment, using your experience, particularly when time is tight and the people who are doing it are very experienced, and so on. So there's dozens of things that are not on that page there. But our strategy here is to use expert judgment, in other words, to use our experience, and maybe the experience of a team, so that it's a better decision. And we pick out so for example, project management methodology emphasizes getting things actually done. And Lean and Six Sigma, they will focus maybe more on picking out the right project, and then there's a sort of an overlap into the project itself, and so forth. So the name of the game is not to say we have to take one or other of these things here, but it's to pick the best of them, but that suit our situation. And one of the key things here that we would have is to agree the charter. You can see at the bottom there. In other words, the document that says this is the project and these are the people who make the decisions and this is the broad outline. Because as quickly as you get that, then at least you know who you're talking to. And if you don't do that, then you don't, and it loses time. So these were the 5 that we picked out for this afternoon. You can read them. Strong sponsors, establish authority quickly as you can, quick wins, we all know about that, accelerate communication and decision making, and the agile mindset. Zorana, your microphone.
I want to avoid the noise on the
Of
street,
course.
so I'd say that as in any project, having the champions on board is really crucial. And the next thing is, of course, the organization and defined roles and responsibilities for everyone in the project, and individual work packages that can be only high level at this stage. but they should exist. Nevertheless, documenting and communicating these at the very beginning helps a great deal for everyone to understand the expectations and to get commitment from all the key stakeholders, especially champions whose engagement can be critical for the success. And champions are actually those who drive project implementation, and especially in emergency situations, having more champions can accelerate the whole thing. Ideally, every sub-project manager should be a champion, ensuring everybody involved is on board and having qualifications and aptitude to understand all the elements of the project. And the next slide is mentioning the vision that has to be established and agreed upon at the very beginning. Establishing a vision and common set of goals is critical to aligning the whole workforce on the task. They will need to know how their contribution is helping the organization towards its goals and what is required of them in order to move forward. Then the next slide is, this slide is talking about the stakeholders, of course, and their identification is crucial in order to move forward with the project from initiation to planning. This means that literally everyone who must do something specific as part of your project delivery, as well as all the others who have impact or will be impacted by the results or project implementation itself. And of course, all projects need to know their stakeholders, because the first thing in planning is, I think this is the previous slide, sorry, you just skipped one, but it's not really important. The first thing in planning is collecting the requirements and thinking about the risks, and our stakeholders are the main source for this information. So you shouldn't forget to consider both people in your own organization and the external ones who might also have certain expectations, and they are the ones that will ultimately decide whether your project is successful or not. And of course, the interactions with the stakeholders must also be managed, and this is what was on the slide that Deasún showed previously. Because everybody has his or her own perspective, which is just natural. And if their expectations at some point are not satisfied and certain requirements are not met, they need to understand, they really need to understand why. And this is the first tip, as summarized on the next slide. So engage strong sponsors and champions, and in general, all the stakeholders should be really engaged from the very beginning of any project.
Yeah, and in fact, if I could come in, there was a very public example of this not working quite right in the last few days in Ireland. There was a discussion about whether they go back to lockdown conditions or not over the whole country. And the people who do the advice went in to meet the government, and the government said, no, we don't agree. And basically, as a project manager, I think they should have had that discussion in private. I don't know anyone in Ireland like to comment on that, Mary, or anyone else. No, okay. So let's move on from that one then. So the next thing that we're focusing on here is establishing authority quickly. And because, you know, things happen because somebody with authority says that we'll do it. And if you don't have authority, then people, they don't want to do it. They think, well, I'm not allowed to, or, you know, I'm not sure if I should, and all that sort of thing. Okay. So the thing that we like here is to use the charter and the document. There's always some sort of a document. It doesn't really matter what it's called, but some sort of a document to start the project. But the key things about it are that it gives an outline of the work as far as you can, because a project is discovery. At the beginning, you don't know exactly how you're going to do everything. So at the beginning, your document is going to be relatively thin, but you also need to have something that gives authority to the project manager. It's got maybe a signature, or it's issued by an important person. Because if, for example, you're an engineer and you go around and you talk to people and you say, well, I'm working on this important project, and they think, oh, this is the young student or the guy who left college last year or something like that, and they can't get any interaction. So that the project manager it's not their job to create their authority. They can strengthen it. But it's really the job of the business to give them that authority. So when they turn up, people will interact with them. And sometimes you get very visible examples of that, where a very senior manager will send a very junior person around and say, when this person turns up, you do what they tell you. And then, of course, if you have a charter, you can use that for talking to the stakeholders. And I find personally doing it on paper with pen and paper and pencil and so on, it gives a feel it's not finalized, or that, and then people will engage and make adjustments and so on. But if you send them an email, electronic version, you tend not to get so much interaction, and experts can interact and so on. And then you get the very first project decision. So one of them is the responsibility, like who's the project manager, for example. It might change as you go through, but you need to know who's there and who makes the decisions to move from one phase to another. And roughly how much time and money you've got at very least. So this is a very famous chart that we've seen a million times before. And what it does is that for each of the activities here, there are 4 on the left-hand side, 4 example activities out of a project. For each of them, we have somebody who is responsible. So you can see an R here and here and here. You can see that these people are being recorded as being responsible. And to match that, usually you have somebody who is also accountable. And the way I describe this is that that's their boss. So for example, if something went wrong today for me, just for example, I had a puncture and I couldn't get in, probably Mary is the person I would call. And because she's close to the thing, she would, interpret the situation and decide what to do. Do we go ahead or whatever? But you've got backup. So by having a responsible and accountable and agreeing at the beginning, you've got a more robust project. And then the same thing happens between consulting and inform. So you can consult with people that you want to be involved. And the great thing about this chart is, of course, that you can use it, put it on the table and get people to interact with it. And, have we got somebody for everything and so on. So it's absolutely not new, but it's very, very powerful for generating that discussion. And also the people listed at the top, they're all sorts of stakeholders. Some of them can be involved deeply in the project and others might be neighbors or bystanders or managers of people that you were working with you or whatever. But the chart it allows for all of that.
Can I just ask the question, does that chart ever cause controversy? Do people disagree? Is it a work in progress, or who makes the decisions over who's responsible?
Well, my cut on that, but I'll ask Zorana after she has a comment on it as well. But my cut on that is that if you're doing a project, you need to know who's doing it. So if you're doing your undersea cables and they're going to be connected up to a windmill or something like that, you need to know who's going to do it. And I think that in a lot of projects, you talk about in things being in progress, and that means that the data is never accurate. My own opinion is that the data should be accurate, and if you need to change it, you change it in a controlled way. And if need be, it can be done very quickly, but you need to know that the document itself is correct.
But I do think it's crucial that everybody on the team is involved, and that is everybody on the team, that you have the agreement of that everybody's comfortable with whatever is in this matrix, because this is actually the part of the project management plan. And although the project manager usually leads all the planning efforts, all the team members are involved, and all these documents are created through collaboration of all the team members. Of course, somebody needs to draft something, and usually the initiatives comes from the project manager. But then, of course, I think the agreement of everybody is really important in order to move forward, and that everybody accepts his or her own roles and responsibilities on the projects and commit to what he needs to do, to be responsible for.
Thank you.
And I think you also get situations where people, as they say, have to live with it. The boss says, well, I'm sorry, you have to do it. But at least there's an acceptance, as Zorana says, that They've got to accept that they're going to do it. Otherwise, something's not going to happen. An example I saw years ago was a team did something like this, and the person who was expected to do a particular thing just kept quiet. And then they said, "Well, you're doing it, aren't you?" And said, "No, no, no, no. Well, but it's your job." They said, "Yeah, but when you want to do it, it's my holiday, you know." So, you know, so she didn't even interact with it. And then somebody had to say, "Well, could somebody else come in and could we share it around?" I think it's really good because you can share out the work in very, you know, you might have 10 or 15 tasks and you can divide them out in very small chunks. So the quick answer is not, people don't always agree, but if somebody puts that down without having had some of the discussion, then you'd certainly get objections to it, I think, Mary. So yeah, and then that can go into the charter, and then it helps this discussion that we're having. So what I've got here is an outline of the sort of things that I might expect in a charter. So the business case usually doesn't come from the project manager. It's something you're given. You're told this is the reason we're doing this, and your job as project managers, go away and do it. But you certainly need to know what it is, because you, as project manager, you have to motivate people, and you can't tell them, well, we've got to do it because we were told to do it, not in, you know, because then they won't do it. Obviously, objectives, things like that, requirements, assumptions I've already mentioned, scope statement. How broad is this? You know, you know, is it our job to just install the stuff, or do we have to commission it as well? And do we have to train the people, or do we have to train the whole world? You know, that's scope, and so on and so on. So there's nothing there that's surprising. But the bottom line, I think, is very important. The authorization. You've got to know who the people are, because if you don't have agreement on that, then you can't move forward. You know, you might know what you need to do, and then you have to find out who's going to agree with it. So, oops, slides are jumping, sorry. So the tip there is to establish the authority quickly with the charter. And again, Mary, are there any comments there coming in? No, okay, so we'll move forward.
Yes, and as Deasún said, when we have a charter, we should then move into planning, like with any other project, of course, but identifying the quick wins first. And in order to actually get to the quick wins, we need to focus on the real problem first and understand the pain points that the project is aiming to address. And of course, if the root causes are not identified, effort can be spent on the wrong things. And this cause as a consequence the delays that can and should be avoided. Properly identified root causes often can contribute even to better engagement of the stakeholders, because if people understand the whys, it is usually easier and more straightforward to move into hows, and then the generating the ideas and creative involvement of the whole team is much easier. On the next slide, I would just like to mention some of the common tools. So Deasún, if you could move to
yeah, there you go, sorry.
it's the one with the fishbone, yes. That can be used for validating these root causes. And this is this fishbone, and you can have each of the possible quick wins as an individual effect that you want to achieve, for example. And this is not really a plan, but it certainly brings the structure, enabling the project manager to identify all the sub-projects, for example, that are required to address certain issues. And this is shown on the next slide. So by setting those up as separate projects, each can have its own champion, for example, and he can progress, these sub-projects can progress independently, assuming, of course, that all the responsibilities are clearly defined and properly communicated with all the stakeholders. Now, for the brainstorming, it can be useful, but there is also one technique. This is an extra tip for me, called reverse brainstorming. I don't know whether you have ever heard about reverse brainstorming, but I think it works really well, and I tried it a couple of times, because it builds on our natural ability to more easily see problems than solutions. So instead, for example, of asking a group of people to brainstorm ideas that would work, the group brainstorms all the ways that they could cause a plan to fail. So this technique is used because it can often be easier to criticize and see gaps in a plan than to outline a strategy for success. So once the group has the list, they can look at these specific examples and come up with different ways to achieve the exact opposite effect. So the tip is to always identify the quick wins first. And of course, you can use the reverse brainstorming whenever you feel it is really hard to come up with a set of positive ideas on how to address certain challenges.
Okay, so the next one that we have is to speed up decision making and communications. And sorry, the slides are jumping a lot. Let me go back. Here we go. We probably, nearly all of us know a schedule network. It's been around for years, and I think it's valid. The logic of it is valid, even in agile environments. So you've got to do this before you've done that. You've got to put the lid on before you cook the dinner, and so on. You know, whatever it is, you've got those sequences. In an agile situation, you might have a very large number of steps and so on. That's fine. But the basic idea is that you can draw a diagram which says, well, we do this first, and then we do this, and then we do this. And then we're looking at time. We're looking to get our project going quickly. So one of the things is that if we don't do something early, then it actually blocks everything that follows it. So it could be something stupid, or not necessarily stupid, but simple. It could be somebody needs authority to go into a dangerous area, and somebody should sign it, and the person who should sign it is not there, and and then the whole project is held up. And it often happens at the beginning of a project because it hasn't built up a dynamic, and people think, oh, it's not really moving yet, so it doesn't really matter if I do this next week or the week after. But it still takes time, and so being conscious and actually doing things as they come up and trying to get rid of them one by one to tick them off, as it were. Another thing that will lose time is handovers that are not managed. So, for example, let's take the example of the airplane handover that's being sold to an airline or something like that. I saw a film on that, and they said they go to Lufthansa and they spend a week going over it and so on. But they need everything. You've got to make sure that the people, that they have the certificates, and maybe there are some things that are a bit different from the original spec, and that needs to be explained. And then they need the training material, and so on and so on and so on. And when they've got it all, they say, right, we've got it. But if, for example, they say, well, we're going to land the airplane and you can have a look at it, then obviously the people who are looking at it, they might not know everything. The people who are delivering it should know it very well. So you really need managed handover to save time. The other way of doing it is much slower, and it's not as efficient. You might miss things. And another big one I find is management decisions are not available when needed. In other words, management are not available, because by definition in an organization, the people at the top are making decisions and they're passing the work down, or they're trying to keep everybody on track, as it were, to the strategy. And by definition, the people at the top, they're in the focus. So we all know it, they're 150 mails a day and all the rest of it. And then, of course, they have to travel and they're not there when you need them. So you need a decision, right? We've got our prototype and we want to send it out to the world now. And, oh, this manager is not there. Well, we can't because they've just gone on a trip to Asia or something like that. So management decisions need to be there on time. I'm just going to stop again and ask, is there any comments on that from anyone coming in, either in writing or spoken? Anyone want to say anything?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
We have a shy audience this evening.
Okay. So here's the thing that describes this thing about delay. So we all know this schedule network. These are a 10-day task, a 5-day task, and so on and so on. And if you do the calculation, if I've done it right, it's 26 days. But, oops, sorry, I keep jumping. So imagine what happens here. Supposing that between these two tasks here, there's an extra one where, well, there's a task where you need the manager to make the decision and the manager is not there, you know? So if you put that in and redo the calculation, you find that you need 34 days instead of 26. So you need 30% more time. But people don't see this because very often the list of tasks for a project, in my experience, it's all the things that you physically do. You know, it's install this and test that and so on and so on. But the communication things or the decisions very often are not written down as actions. And they take time anyway, because people need to be briefed. Even if you have a phase meeting or something, you need to prepare documents and so on. But if the manager is not available, then that blocks what's happening. And another example, here we are, that's worked better, is that supposing there's a handover between two departments, or two different parts of a company in different locations or something like that, and for whatever reason it doesn't happen correctly, the material or the information isn't provided, then you lose more time. And with the numbers I have on the screen there, you could end up with 46% increase over the original estimation. So the point is that it's these I think there needs to be a lot of focus on the key decisions that we're going to need to know, and it's going to need the right people, and they must be there on time, and they need to be aware how important it is that the decision comes out on time. And if you don't do that, you lose time. So we're talking here about getting things going. And that's why in an emergency situation, it's very hard, because the roles have not been defined at the beginning anyway. So the tip here is to accelerate the communications.
Excuse me, Deasún, we have a question from Andrew Lennon.
Go.
Waiting on management authorization can be very frustrating. It's been a particular problem in the past, especially clients in a previous employment who didn't understand that they were delaying projects.
Zorana, do you want to comment on that? You're nodding away.
I completely agree with Andrew.
Yeah, and the problem,
I fully do.
Yeah, and I find that the managers, they don't realize that they're actually blocking the system. They think, well, I'll turn up when I feel like it. That's my experience anyway. So it definitely happens, and if they need to be there at the time, then they need to be built in. And in my view, the actual decision making needs to be a task which is on the thing, and you get them involved. It's on the RACI chart, and you tell them if it doesn't happen, then it will delay the project, and they understand that, and you make that visible.
I think it's a general issue with the organizational structures, not only related to projects, and because very often these procedures are very complex and complicated, and the communication is very complex. So then the organizations become less flexible and less able to adapt to different challenges. And this is why I think the agile approach is more and more getting into the focus nowadays. And I think that especially with the agile approach, people are trying to address issues like this, especially on projects. I don't know whether Andrew would, if you would agree, because in Agile, the customer is the ultimate. The main thing is to satisfy the customer, to keep the customer satisfied, and then the whole organization aims in simplicity and direct communications and a lot of collaboration with the customer, so that all these obstacles that originate from the organization structure are somehow overcome in order to deliver a project.
Sorry, if you can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. What I found at the moment is I work very closely with my clients in almost an agile way. And I try not to have very long project descriptions and scopes of work of exactly what I'm going to do. I more or less try to work out what their objective is and satisfy it, rather than enormous long scopes of work, and that works quite well. Our big problem is quite often both the client and then myself, we find ourselves sometimes at the end of quite a long chain in the supply chain, and further up along there's people who need to release data or tell you what they're going to do sub-C. I come back with a problem, and then we tell them there's a problem, and then they go dark for 2 months before coming back and telling us what they can do. And then they come back and say, "Oh, actually, sorry, we can't install that subsea." And this is quite common. So we have to try and keep nudging them just enough.
Yes, well, yes, I mean, I'm very familiar with the situation, and I think that the main reason there is that I came across very often that the organization want to be agile, but they don't understand the efforts they need to put in to actually create the surroundings for implementing the agile approach. So I think as much as I think agile has so many good things to offer, I think it's quite a challenge for the organization to actually implement agile, because they usually make mistakes when they want to become agile, because they don't understand that it's not really about doing things in a different way when it comes to project management, but it also assumes a completely different culture. I mean, if you want to make people responsible for what they do, if they are going to take over the responsibility, then you need to enable them to do so.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah, having worked in a similar way in a previous company where I ran a team and I ran an office for the company, it takes quite a lot of training to get people up and to get to break it down so that you push the responsibility further down onto the people.
Exactly.
But the big advantage is when something goes a little bit wrong with a project, or when something becomes super duper urgent, or to the point of being an emergency, which happens, then what happens is that the work almost automatically divides itself up between 6 people, and everybody just takes it, just kind of cracks on with it. And the project management requires 1 cup of coffee, 1 round of coffee, and a packet of biscuits if you're lucky, and it almost sorts itself out. But it's a long, long road to get to people being that good.
Yeah, but at least I think that we should try to build awareness in the organization that this is important and that this is needed, so that they start working on it at least. I mean, it is a long way to the ideal situation, but at least they need to build awareness that this is something that needs to be done before we become agile.
So Zorana, I think we're into your section here on the, you've covered a lot of this
yes,
already.
Actually the last tip was about the agile mindset and the SMART objectives. And I recently read some articles that are very much criticizing the SMART objectives and making it some sort of opposite to agile approach. But I still think that the main reason that SMART targets are used is because it is, when you have them, it is easy to know whether you have succeed or failed. So if a target is easy to measure and has to be done by a certain time, then there can be very little argument whether it has been achieved or not. So this makes it very clear for the individual what they are expected to achieve, and so it will really help focus the team. But what about agile? Since the highest priority, as I said before, is to satisfy the customer, agile puts emphasis on individual interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over negotiating a contract. But what's most important, I think, it's responding to change over following a plan. I mean, I think that's the main difference between the traditional approach, which is like spend enough time in building the plan and then do as planned. So the project manager in traditional project management is sort of like a guardian of the plan, and he doesn't want it to be changed. But with the agile, we actually want the change because it drives the progress. We are collaborating with the customer, with the client, and we are all the time trying to discover all the requirements and all different expectations that they even might not be aware of, in order to fine-tune what we are doing and to reach ultimate satisfaction at the very end. So the agile approach also encourages these effective communication practices that can save time on projects, and it actually emphasizes simplicity, directness, and face-to-face conversations. This can then bring the team to the situation where the one with the yes with the comment.
Sorry, for some reason they're jumping on me.
Yes, this can then then the team when this is in the focus, like the simplicity, openness, straightforward communication, then the team becomes more able to prioritize issue resolution really quickly, because they actually rely on the consistency and the team culture that is developed based on agile principles. And I think this is crucial in order for the agile approach to be implemented successfully in the organization. And nevertheless, I think that SMART objectives are still relevant, since, as mentioned before, they provide a sense of direction, motivation, and a really clear focus, and they clarify importance for the whole team. So as the last tip, the idea is to embrace agile and at the same time set SMART objectives for the team, because by setting the goals, we're providing ourselves with a target to aim for, but also we are enabling the team to be successful in achieving them, which is usually the biggest challenge in all projects, because we are not usually lacking creative solutions, but where we struggle is actually when it comes to implementing those. So I don't know, Deasún, whether you have anything to add.
I make one comment on Agile. Where I live, they introduced a new line of trams about 10 years ago. And when they wanted to drive them around, they discovered that there was no heating in the driver compartment, so they couldn't use them in the winter. And the Agile solution was to send somebody to the supermarket to buy electric heaters. So they bought up so many hundred electric heaters and gave them out to the tram drivers. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I wouldn't really call it agile. I mean,
well, the decision maker it was one of those things. There was a quick decision, whereas in a lot of environments there would never be a solution. You know? But I'm also looking at the clock, so I'm going to hand back to Mary. I think we don't have questions and answers, but we've had them as we've been going through. Mary.
Thank you very much, Deasún and Zorana. Lots and lots of tips and ideas there. It's certainly given me lots of things to think about in my day-to-day, both at work and not at work. So there'll be lots of new projects coming up, and they'll be agile, and we'll have to set some SMART objectives. So thank you very much. That was wonderful. Just before I hand